Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about author's craft again and how authors are utilizing every tool in their toolbox to make their stories and text unique. This may be examples of how they use different voice, presenting different tones or different moods, their word choice, using figurative language. So let's look a little bit today at some of those different types of author's craft that we're seeing in author's texts. So, while reading, have you ever been struck by the clever way an author has written something where it just like sticks with you? It's a funny way they said it, or you remember a line that a character said. This is an example of author's craft. So, we're going to look at this little example from the text Bedhead by Margie Platini. It says Oliver's hair was out of control. Way out of control. There was hair going this way, hair going that way, hair going up, down, around, and around. And there was one teeny tiny clump of hair way at the back of his head that looked just like a cat's coughed up fur ball. So that's pretty funny, right? Let's look at what example we see. The author is using right here. It says the author's use of opposites definitely help the reader create this image where it's saying hair went this way, up, down, around. We can really imagine what that hair is looking like. Furthermore, this section has a little bit of rhythm because it's fun to read. We have the hair going this way, hair going up, down, around, and we can see that kind of rhythm they're building here in their text. So it's really interesting that we can also kind of see that the author has really put in their special touch here. So when we read and we notice those things, what we're really noticing is the author's craft. So take a note of this right here. Authors are purposeful. They never do anything without a purpose. They will intentionally use these certain little techniques in order to engage you as the reader and hook you in. They want to use their best writing practices because they want to, one, sell their books and really keep their readers interested in their work. So, whenever a reader will notice and appreciate those interesting ways that authors either write a particular sentence or paragraph, the reader is analyzing and appreciating and examining their craft. So, trying to really get to know that author on a deeper level. So let's look at an example of how authors will use different types of figurative language and different word choices. So, biggest thing that we need to make sure we're paying attention to is that good quality readers will analyze or peel those onion layers and really make judgments about how effective they think this author is being with their craft. Are they making good choices of using certain words, different types of figurative language? Are they keeping their readers hooked? So, a wide variety of techniques might be noted by a reader who stops to appreciate the author's craft. Some of those are the voice, the imagery, how they create that picture in your mind, analogies, figurative language, word choice, and sentence fluency. Does it sound fluid? Does it make you feel a rhythm? Are you kind of feeling like it's choppy, or is it really smooth as you read? It flows together. Those are all examples of how the author uses all the tools in their toolbox to really engage you as the reader and make their writings unique. So a reader becomes more proficient, which means that you are becoming a quality reader and you are good at noticing the author's craft. And that really starts with being able to detect those techniques and observing it. And then you, as a writer, you need to be thinking about how can I use some of these techniques in my own writing? Now, let's look at some of these common techniques that we are noticing and appreciating as readers, and let's see if we can detect what it is. So, we see this imagery idea is that authors appeal to at least some of our five senses to create imagery. So, either our sight, our smell, our taste, our hearing, and our touch. They may be really descriptive with their words to create this imagery where we can really see it come to life, and it helps with our mental picture. So let's take a look at this. This is an excerpt from the text Hoot. It says right here for us a note for us to know, preface kind of what's going on and help us understand because we have not read the whole chapter book of Hoot. We're just reading this little excerpt. It says, in the paragraph before this one, Roy was hit in the head by a golf ball. So let's read and let's pinpoint some of the parts that we believe is imagery and that the author is using to create those mental pictures in our head. When the golfers ran up and saw Roy face down in the sand trap, they thought he was dead. Roy heard their frantic cries, but he didn't move. The sugar white sand felt cool against his burning cheek, and he was very sleepy. So I want you to pause a second and I want you to make some mental notes here and say, what do I think? Which words are specifically helping create those mental pictures? Which words or phrases could be that imagery that the author is using? Okay, now that you've had some time to reflect on your own, let's pinpoint some of those things. First things first, we can see that it says Roy heard their frantic cries, meaning if we're reading this, we can imagine if we are Roy, then we would be able to hear cries from other people, so people speaking out. We see that sugar white sand. Sugar is something we know that tastes really good, and also we know what it looks like. It's a very white, grainy texture. So that's how they're describing the sand. Now we can really get that image in our mind of what the sand looks like that Roy is seeing. And then we see that felt cool against his burning cheek. You know, when I make an inference here and I put two and two together, I've experienced what that feels like. If I've been outside running around and I get really hot and then I feel something really cool like my mother's hand right on my cheek, I can feel that coolness going from her hand to my cheek and it feels nice, right? When we're really hot and bothered. So I want you to think about how could I use imagery like this in my own writing? Really, what it is, friends, is that the author is being really descriptive with their words and appealing to those five senses. All right, now what about some figurative language? So we're going to read the following definitions and we're going to try to figure out hey, is this a specific type of figurative language? This is important that we understand figurative language and we know our figurative language so that we can detect it when we're reading our own text. So, what would be a comparison of two things using words like or as? Pause and take your guess, and then we'll check. All right, this would be a simile. Good job. What about a direct comparison of two things? Meaning it's kind of similar to a simile. It compares two things, but it says direct comparison. Take a guess. All right, this is a metaphor. So similes and metaphors kind of go together, but similes are a little bit different because they use that like or as. We'll look at some examples in a second. What about repeated sounds at the beginning of words? Now it's repeated sounds, not repeated words. Repeated sounds. You're right, it's alliteration. We've looked at that a little bit because we know that in authors' persuasive opinion techniques, they sometimes will use alliteration to catch your attention. Did you know that that's actually the author's craft? Now, what about a word that represents a sound, like ouch, kabam? What would that be? That is called onomatopoeia. Now, what about an extreme exaggeration? We've heard of this before. Exaggeration. This is that type of word that we said authors will use in their persuasive or opinion techniques. You're right, it's a hyperbole. Now, what about this? Giving human qualities to an object, meaning that something that's not living and not alive is acting or speaking like a human. We're giving them human qualities. What would that be an example of? Personification. Awesome. All right, now let's look at this and let's say, which type of figurative language do I see in this excerpt? Remember, excerpt just means that it is a piece of a whole writing. We have taken a piece out of a larger piece of writing and we are just looking at this one little section. I'll read it and I want you thinking, would this be a simile? Would this be a metaphor, alliteration, onomatopoeia, hyperbole, or personification? It says, the light in the jar turned yellow, like a flashlight left on too long. I tried to swallow, but something in my throat would not go down, and the light grew dimmer, green, like moonlight underwater. I want you to pause a second and try to reflect and really look at the parts carefully and say, what type of figurative language do I see? All right, so what about yellow, like a flashlight left on too long? What about the green, like moonlight underwater? I think that what you have been seeing is a little bit of a simile. Now, I'm sorry, my image right here at the bottom is covering up that word simile, but I want you to think, what makes this a simile? Well, a simile compares two things and it uses the word like or as. Can we see that right here? The light in the jar is being compared to a flashlight being left on too long. And then down here, we see that the light grew dimmer in a green color, and that green color of the light is being compared to moonlight underwater. And I can see that word like right here. Good job, guys. Now, I want us to think about, I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit, and I want us to kind of see some different examples as we go along. I will put this Google slide in your work for today so you can reflect back on it yourself. But I would like to get to just something else really fast, author's voice. So this is not the audible voice I can hear, but rather this is where I can get an idea of the personality of the person telling the story. And it becomes easy to detect when I pay attention carefully. I have to analyze and think deeply. So I would like us to think about this as we read this excerpt from Skinny Bones by Barbara Park, is what type of voice we're seeing in this excerpt. It says, "Anyway, I do play other sports besides square dancing. Like TJ, I've played Little League for 6 years now. But to tell you the truth, I'm not exactly what you'd call a real good athlete. Actually, I'm not even okay. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is I stink." What type of voice do you think this person or the personality you're gaining from the person telling this story? Well, let's see. We can see that the narrator of this story is just being brutally honest fifth grade boy who often gets into trouble because of his big mouth. The author makes his personality shine through. And what we want to see is that with voice, I can really kind of gain and say, maybe the voice here is just what they suggest. It's just being brutally honest. It's something that, I'm gaining this idea that the young boy is a little bit sassy, right? Like he's very certain of himself and straightforward. We would call that he's very blunt, right? He's just straight to it. I think we had that as a vocabulary word here recently. So sometimes we can really kind of connect with these personalities because the author has done such a great job with their word choice and bringing out that voice. Awesome job. Now, what about an analogy? Sometimes these authors will try to explain complex feelings by creating an analogy. So let's take a look here. When I try to remember my whole entire life, it feels like a Lego project where you're missing some of the important pieces. Like a robot mini fridge or a monster truck wheel. You do the best you can to put things together, but it's not quite like the picture on the box. So when we look at this, I would like you to think for a second and say, what potentially is the analogy? Now, if you need to stop for a second and do some handy dandy research, pause this video and go research the definition of an analogy. I want to put your research and skills to the test if you can figure out the definition of an analogy. Now, if you actually have made it this far in the video and you haven't skipped ahead, I will give you a free homework pass if you email me right now with the definition of analogy. Glad you're listening, those that are staying with me. So I'd like you to, after you do that, go ahead and think right now, pause the video, and take a second to evaluate what parts of this excerpt would be considered the analogy. So, right here, he says, my whole entire life is like this Lego project where you're missing some of the important pieces. Okay. And then, oh, I went too far. So, when we see this analogy, he's comparing this one thing to the next here, where he is creating this kind of feeling of, oh my goodness, I feel like my life is like this Lego project and I'm missing this big piece, and some of these important things in my life are missing. So he's using this great example of a Lego project to compare his life. He's using this to explain something further. Awesome stuff. Now, let's look a little bit lastly at sentence fluency. So, when we think about sentence fluency, friends, we're talking about that, when they start their sentences and they become really long, it has to flow. It can't be choppy and it can't be something that loses the reader all the way in. So, let's look at this example right here and see if we can kind of figure out this kind of sentence fluency vibes. What are we gaining from this? So, it says, I am alone now and I am all that is left of my family. His father, who had sent Salva to school, brought him treats like mangoes, trusted him to take care of the herd. His mother, always ready with food and milk in a soft hand to stroke Salva's head. His brothers and sisters, whom he had laughed with and played with and looked after. He would never see them again. How can I go on without them? So, when we look at this, I want you to understand that the author really creates a very memorable moment where when he is wanting to kind of state the feelings or certain parts, he keeps that sentence really short. But when he wants to create this longer memory with more details and get us inside his head, kind of like listening to his thoughts, isn't that sentence a little bit longer? What is he using right here where my mouse is? He's using that punctuation that three periods in a row create that kind of longevity and carrying over thoughts, right? Whenever you see that, that means that it kind of leaves this person thinking and pondering. So, a lot of times, sentence fluency here is that we're referring to where starting sentences will look a little bit different as we go along, but it keeps the flow of the reading and makes it easier for the reader to connect to. So, friends, I would like us to just take a moment to really digress and kind of think about all these different elements that authors will use just to keep the reader hooked and engaged. It's so crazy to me because it's like, oh my goodness, an author is willing to do so many different things and really enhance their writing with all these different techniques just to keep their readers engaged, happy, and keeping them wanting more. I think about, one of my favorite authors, J.K. Rowling with Harry Potter. I can tell there's a lot of different things that she used. Some of these techniques like figurative language and voice, and really creating the personalities of her characters with her word choice. It really kept me wanting to read more. It's what kept me reading those big, long chapter novel books of hers and finishing them all the way through. They never became boring because her craft was so interesting. She was using so many different things. So, friends, what you're going to do now is you're going to create a foldable of all these author crafts. So, go ahead and look at the directions for that. I'm excited in what you're gaining with Author's Craft, and we will talk more about this later. See you later.